This is the first of a series of videos I made to document my electric skateboard build. In this video, I'll discuss how to make a longboard deck from veneer plywood. There are many reasons why you could want to build a custom longboard deck. I wanted to make mine because I couldn't find a pre-made one online that I liked, and I also wanted to save cost in my electric skateboard build. With materials and glue, I was in about $20 to make this board. There are many ways and many materials you can use to make a skateboard or a longboard. Right here I have an 1/8 inch piece of Baltic birch plywood. It's a 5x5 sheet. I also have my template here for my longboard. It's approximately 38 inches long. Now you don't need the template for the glue up of the board. You just need an idea of what you want your dimensions to be. Now Baltic birch plywood is stronger in one direction and weaker in another. So you have to keep that in mind when you're cutting up your Baltic birch plywood or whatever sheet of plywood you use for your longboard. After marking out my pieces, I was ready to cut. I decided to use my table saw, but any saw like a jigsaw or a circular saw would also work too, and is probably a hell of a lot safer. Now a board bought off the shelf has a deck that is typically 16 ply, which means there's 16 layers within that board. Most DIY boards or kit boards, in which you can buy kits from woodcraft stores or order them online, are anywhere between 8 layers all the way up to 12. Making mine out of plywood, I have an 1/8 inch piece which has a thick core layer with a thinner top and bottom veneer, so there's some orientation to the plywood. Typical materials include maple, birch, and if you're lucky and you can get your hands on it, bamboo. Boards are typically 1/2 inch thick, and I decided to cut 2 pieces in the direction of the grain, 2 against it, so that way I'd have some flex, that way I wouldn't feel every rock and pothole that I hit, but also I would be firm enough to hold the electronics for my electric skateboard. 1/8 inch plywood has 3 layers to it, so with 4 layers of 1/8 inch plywood at 3 layers per ply, that would be a total of 12 layers, or 12 ply. For the mold, I have a 2x10 with 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood nailed to the side, so that way I can have some curvature to my board. I have a piece of plywood for holding down the center of it when I clamp it, and I have my 4 pieces of plywood. I have Type Bond 2 glue, since this is mainly an outdoor application. Type Bond 1 is usually for inside stuff. Type Bond 3 is, you can use it, but it's not necessary. Glue is stronger than wood no matter what. I have blocks, and then I have C-clamps. So yeah, you can ignore whatever you find displeasurable to look at. So I laid out each piece, and then I spread the glue evenly with an old credit card, and then I obviously set each piece on top of the other. Then the race was on from here to get the blocks and all of the clamps set up, which sadly was a complete failure. The issue I'm having is that this board wasn't long enough, and so I was trying to accommodate that. I ultimately ended up just tearing the whole setup apart, finding a longer 2x10, nailing new longer strips of 1/2 inch plywood on the side, and then trying to set that up, which by that point, the glue had already set up for pretty well, but I still was able to force the shape I wanted. Not as drastic, but after thinking about it, after this glue up, there was a better way to do this. Now one of the reasons that the glue up was so hard is that it was hard to hold the clamps and get everything in position while I was doing the glue up. What I should have done was taken an ordinary 2x4, and instead, if you can really see this picture, it's quite complicated. I should have just taken a 2x4, put it up and down, cut it on the bandsaw or jigsaw or whatever, the shape, the curvature that I wanted, and then use the top and bottom pieces as my blocks for the clamps. That way it would have been so much easier, and I would have gotten the curvature that I wanted, and it would have come out a little bit better, even though I am very satisfied with the way it came out. So if I ever make any more boards or I mass produce them, I will definitely do them this way. Commercial skateboards are made with a hydraulic metal press, and they do like 10 boards at a time, and once it's forced in, it's done. There's no having to hold it up in the clamps. But this method worked. Now on to the rest of the skateboard. Next step is to put all that junk away and cut out said skateboard. I found a template online with a design that I liked, And usually when I use templates on projects, I usually take a glue stick and I glue the template to the workpiece. But since I modified this template after printing it out, I want to keep it. So I'm using a pen to trace the template onto the workpiece. And before removing the template, I used an adze and I marked all of the center holes for the trucks for the longboard. Now, the template had some marks for some longboard truck holes on there, but they weren't right. But they were centered with the template, so I sort of adjusted them appropriately to fit the trucks that I bought. Despite it not being the safest tool in the shop, I used my bandsaw that I built to cut out my deck because it's quicker and easier than getting out and using a jigsaw. However, in this application, a jigsaw is probably safer and just as good, if not a better tool to use. I cut about an 1/8 inch outside the lines I had marked with my stencil because I'll go back with my sander and I'll shape the board to the exact shape that I want all the way up to the lines. I am very blessed to have an oscillating drum sander to smooth out all my edges. If you don't have one, you can sit there with sandpaper or a file. It'll take you a little bit longer, but those are equally just as good of a route instead of doing it like this. So after I finished shaping the board and smoothing all the edges, I tried to hold the board at a 45-degree angle so I could sort of round over the edges since it was curved. This wasn't going very well, so despite that, I took it over to the router table and rounded over all the edges and then cleaned it up with a piece of sandpaper. It was after this step that I realized that I had done such a good job curving either end of the deck that if I tried to lean the board against the wall, that it wasn't going to lean very well. So I took the deck over to the belt sander and I held it up straight up against it, so that way I could cut like a flat edge, so that way when I leaned up the deck against the wall, it would stay. It was also at this step that I realized that I wish I had left more room between the back of the trucks and the end of the deck. That way I would have more of a kicktail, so that way I didn't have to bend over to pick up the board. There is still like slightly enough kicktail, that way I can press down the board to pick it up. But I just wish there was a little bit more, so keep that in mind when you're designing your longboard deck. But after flattening the ends, the next thing I did was take the deck over to the drill press and I drilled those holes for the truck screws that I had marked out earlier when I still had the template on there. Now, because these are machine screws that are going to be tightened on with bolts, you want to go for a slightly larger hole than what the size of your bolts are. I usually try to get pretty exact just for rigidity's sake, but if you're a little bit bigger, it doesn't matter. You're just going to tighten it with a bolt anyway. It doesn't have to lock in the wood. Because I have countersink screws, the next thing I did after drilling the holes with the drill press is that I took a countersink bit and countersinked all of the holes I had drilled. It's also important to add that in order to hold the board flat, because it was curved, I used those 2 thin strips of plywood on either end, just in order to make sure that the screw holes would be perpendicular to the board. Next, I went ahead and mounted all of my hardware to my deck, and then I spent some time riding it around, making sure the deck was going to work out, make sure it felt good. And I don't have any longboard experience, so this is my first time actually learning how to ride a longboard. So this is what the board looks like after about 3 days of riding. So next, I'm going to make a quick tutorial about how to mount all of your hardware to your deck. And then at the end of the tutorial series, I will probably finish the board because I want to wait until I have all of my electrical components screwed in. I know where all the screw holes are going to be. I need to finish sanding the board, so I'm probably going to go over it with a power sander at 80 grit, then 120 with some hand sandpaper, and then maybe 240 if I have it. Sanding is its own hobby, so it's unnecessary to do anything insane, especially on a longboard. Then I'm going to try and stain it. I'll see if that looks good. I'm going to try it on a test piece first. I have some red stain I want to try out. And then if that doesn't work out, or even if it does, I'm then going to cover it in 2 coats of oil-based polyurethane on top and bottom, and then put grip tape on the top and call it a day. So I had a lot of fun making this deck. I can't wait until the rest of my electrical components come in so I can finish the rest of this build. And if you have any questions, please, if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to comment them on the video or send me a message on YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you so much. I'll have the next video coming out really soon.
wanna be your man, girl. So, I just wanna be your